Luigi Key was not a man who shared. He did not share his company, he did not share his time, and he most certainly did not share the attention of his assistant, Melissa Davis. From behind the glass walls of his office, he watched her laugh at something on her phone screen, and a cold, quiet rage began to solidify in his chest. Her phone had been a source of constant buzzing all week, a private universe existing just beyond his reach, a world he was not invited into. Melissa was the absolute core of his operations, the one person he entrusted with every detail of his professional life. But this secret joy she possessed was a puzzle he could not solve, and it infuriated him. He despised the tight, constricting feeling in his chest whenever her shoulders trembled with a silent laugh. Power, he believed, existed to protect what was yours. And in this moment, he felt utterly and completely powerless. To understand how a man like this unravels, you have to watch him lose the one thing he cannot buy. His finger pressed the intercom button, the click echoing in the silent room. "Melissa, I need you to step in," he commanded, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. She entered a moment later, holding a tablet, her own phone left pointedly face down on her desk. She was dressed in a simple white blouse and a black skirt, an outfit that on anyone else would be forgettable, but on her, it was a constant, low-level distraction. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, but a few rebellious strands had escaped to frame a face that seemed far too honest for the world he inhabited. "You moved the Mason meeting," he stated, not as a question, but as an accusation. "Yes, to 11 o'clock tomorrow morning," she confirmed, her tone perfectly even. "Your call with the Chicago office is still confirmed for 3 this afternoon." She gestured to a neat stack of documents on his desk. "The Lawson contracts are prepared. I have marked signature lines with red tabs and areas for notes with blue ones." She was flawless in her execution, always one step ahead. That precision was what made the current situation so much worse. Why was some unknown person receiving the smiles he was never permitted to see? "Will there be anything else, sir?" she inquired, and her professional formality felt like a brick wall constructed between them. A part of him wanted to dismiss her, to let her return to her secret digital conversation and the happiness it brought her. Instead, he heard his own voice, cold and measured, ask, "You have been occupied with your phone a great deal today." The polite mask she wore seemed to tighten, just a fraction. "I have completed all of my assigned work." "I did not suggest that you had not," he countered, enjoying the slight shift in power. "Then I am not sure what the issue is." A small spark of defiance finally ignited in her eyes. He found he liked it far more than he should have. "This is a professional environment, Melissa," he said, his voice deliberately flat, draining it of all emotion. He saw her swallow a much sharper reply, her throat moving just once. "I understand. I will be more careful with my time." As she pivoted to leave, his voice stopped her again. "Melissa, if there is a matter that is urgent, you know you can tell me." For a long moment, her back remained rigid and turned toward him. Then she angled her head just enough for him to see her elegant profile against the light. "It is a personal matter," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But it has been handled." Personal. The word landed like a carefully aimed stone, a deliberate cut to remind him of his boundaries. He could only offer a stiff nod in response, and she left, closing the door quietly, leaving him alone with his rising tide of frustration. Just a few minutes later, she reappeared in the doorway, a small, tentative smile on her face. "I am going to grab a coffee. Would you like your usual?" He simply nodded, the gesture stiff. "Black, with no sugar." Her smile widened slightly. "I know." He tracked her movements as she walked away, her quiet confidence a fresh source of irritation. And then he heard it. A distinct buzz, followed by another. Her phone, abandoned on her desk, lit up, its screen glowing with an incoming notification. A message preview slid across the lock screen. He told himself to remain seated, to show some measure of respect for her privacy. But his body was already moving, his feet carrying him out of his office as if he were merely going to close his door for privacy. He paused right at her desk just as a second message appeared. It was from a man named Andrew. The name was accompanied by a small stethoscope emoji, a detail that made his blood run cold. The profile picture showed a man with an offensively easy smile and hair that looked professionally styled. The message itself read, "I can come by your place later if you want. You do not have to deal with this by yourself." His hands, which had been hanging loosely at his sides, clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists. Deal with what, exactly? Why would this man be coming by her place? He leaned closer, his heart pounding, and saw a long history of messages scrolling beneath the new one. There were inside jokes, constant check-ins, and even a picture of the very coffee cup she had sent him just that morning. A searing wave of jealousy, hot and acidic, burned through his veins. "Mr. Key," her voice was like a shard of ice, slicing through the heavy silence of the office. Melissa was standing near the elevators, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. Her eyes instantly flickered from his tense face down to her illuminated phone screen, and he saw it all. A flash of pure fear crossed her features before it was instantly buried under her calm, professional mask. "You seem to have left your phone out," he said, his voice hard as stone. She walked silently to the desk, her composure absolute, and quickly pressed the side button, plunging the screen into darkness. "I was only gone for a moment to get our coffee." He just stared at her, the real, ugly truth caught in his throat like a fishbone. He wanted to confess that he was jealous, that he despised the very idea of this Andrew character having any part in her life. He wanted to shake her and demand answers he had no right to ask for. Instead of confronting her, he turned on his heel, walked back into the silent sanctuary of his office, and sat down hard in his leather chair. "From this point forward," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the still open door, "there will be no personal phones permitted at the main desk during business hours." A long, charged silence followed his decree. "Does that rule include my own phone?" she finally asked. He almost let a grim smile show. She never, ever missed a single detail. "Yes," he said, his voice resonating with finality. "It includes yours." The rest of the afternoon became a unique and slow-moving form of torture. He invented meaningless tasks just to call her into his office, just to have her near. He watched her glance unconsciously toward her handbag, her fingers twitching with the unfulfilled need to check her messages. The office gradually emptied out around them, but the tension between the two of them remained, thick, suffocating, and completely unresolved. Every other employee had departed for the night, but Melissa was still there. She had a strict, unspoken rule: she never left the office before he did. He was keenly aware of this fact, and he was also aware that she was running on fumes. Faint, dark circles were beginning to bloom beneath her eyes. The line of her shoulders was rigid with tension. The professional smile she offered him felt hollow, brittle. The sight of her exhaustion bothered him more than he wanted to admit. After sending one last email, he finally stood up. "Melissa," he called out. She materialized in his doorway almost instantly, notebook and pen in hand, ready for another command. "You can go home now," he said. "We are finished for the evening." A flicker of genuine surprise lit up her eyes. "Are you sure, sir?" "We are done," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. She studied his face for a moment, clutching her notebook to her chest like it was a shield. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. He felt his brow furrow. "Why would it not be?" "You just seem different. Did I do something wrong?" Her earnest question felt like a blade twisting in his chest. "No," he said, his voice coming out sharper than he intended. "You did nothing wrong." She flinched at his harsh tone. He consciously forced his voice to soften. "You are, without question, the best assistant I have ever had." A tiny, genuine smile briefly touched her lips. "Thank you, sir." He cleared his throat, feeling a strange discomfort. But this is a high-profile office. People notice things and they talk. I cannot afford to have anyone thinking my lead assistant is distracted. I am not distracted, she insisted, her voice regaining its firmness. My personal life remains completely outside of these doors. He hated that invisible, uncrossable line she always drew between them. Good, he said flatly. As she began to turn away, he spoke her name once more. Melissa. If something is truly wrong, I need to know. I am not asking as your boss. I am asking as the man who is responsible for your safety in this building. Her gaze softened for a second. For my sake, or for the company's? Both, he answered without a moment of hesitation. I am handling it, she said again, her voice barely a whisper. I promise I will not become a burden. He hated that word. You are not a burden, he snapped, the anger surprising even him. She left without saying another word. He stood motionless and watched until the polished elevator doors slid shut, hiding her from his view. For a full, long minute, he remained alone in the vast emptiness of his office, staring at the tense, unfamiliar reflection of his own face in the dark glass. He should have gone home to his sprawling penthouse, to the comfort of his most expensive whiskey. Instead, he walked to his desk, opened a locked bottom drawer, and pulled out a small, unmarked black phone. This device was linked directly to the building's comprehensive security system. With a few taps, he found the camera logs for the front lobby. He watched the footage of Melissa walking out, her coat pulled tightly around her against the night air. Once she was on the sidewalk, she stopped and took out her own phone. The bright screen illuminated her face, casting her in a soft, ethereal glow. She was smiling. A tight, painful knot formed deep in his stomach. He watched as her thumbs moved quickly across the screen, and then she lifted the device to her ear. He could see her listening intently, nodding at words he was not privileged enough to hear. And then she laughed, a soft, genuinely happy sound that felt like a physical blow. Jealousy struck him like a coiled fist to the gut. He abruptly shut off the screen and sat in the growing darkness, his hand clenched so tightly around the security phone that his knuckles ached. He opened his laptop. In the blank waiting search bar, he slowly typed the name he had seen on her phone screen just hours before. Andrew Cole. The results populated the page instantly. Luigi leaned closer to the screen. A handsome, confident face smiled back at him from the top of the page. And right under the name was a professional title. Doctor. His heart slammed violently against his ribs. This was not just some man, he was a specialist, somehow connected to the secret Melissa had been guarding so carefully. Who was this man to her? And why did Luigi Key, a man whose entire empire was built on knowing everything, feel like he was the very last person to know anything that truly mattered? He snapped the laptop shut. Tomorrow, he vowed, he would get his answers, whether she was willing to give them to him or not. Luigi arrived at his office long before the sun had risen. He had not slept a single minute. The doctor's perfect, handsome smile was seared into the back of his mind. He was there by 6:45 in the morning, standing at his window, staring down at the slowly waking city below. The only thing he cared about, the only thing he was waiting for, was the distinct sound of her footsteps. At exactly 7:01, she walked through the main doors. "Good morning, Mr. Key," she said, her voice quiet. She was wearing a pale blue blouse that seemed to make her look even more fragile than the day before. "Morning," he replied without turning from the window. He watched her reflection in the glass as she walked to her desk. She placed her handbag in a drawer, then deliberately took out her phone and put it away as well, a clear act of obedience to his new, unspoken rule. He felt a strange and unsettling mix of victory and guilt. "Your coffee, sir," she said a moment later, placing the warm cup on the corner of his desk. She did not leave right away, hovering for a moment. "About what happened yesterday," she began cautiously. "We do not need to discuss it," he cut in. "I just want to assure you that I am not careless with my duties." "I know," he said quickly, his voice softer than before. You are the most reliable person I know. That has never been in question. She visibly relaxed, the tension leaving her shoulders. Thank you. As she turned to go, a muffled buzz vibrated from inside her desk drawer, loud in the morning quiet. She froze in place. So did he. And in that instant, something brittle and tightly wound inside of him finally broke. Melissa, he said, hearing the strain in his own voice. You can check your phone. I will check it on my break, she replied, her back still to him. What break? What was so important that she was hiding? Close the door, he ordered, his voice low and dangerous. You are distracted again. It will only take a moment, she whispered, her hand still on the doorknob. Melissa. He closed the thick file on his desk with a soft thud. Look at me. She turned around slowly, and he immediately regretted it. Her tired, sincere eyes made him want to pull her into his arms. Is your personal life going to become an interference with your work? He asked, the words tasting like ash. It will not, she promised, her gaze unwavering. And this man? He asked quietly, the question hanging between them. Her face flushed with color. Andrew? He hated the gentle, familiar way she said the name. He is just helping me with something. Something, he repeated, the word flat and empty. She just gave a single nod, offering him nothing more. It was a lie of omission, a tactic he knew all too well because he used it himself. I am fine, she insisted, her voice pleading with him to believe her. He did not believe her for a second, but he knew he could not push her any further without revealing that he had spied on her. So he changed his strategy entirely. We have a long day ahead of us, he said, his tone shifting back to business. I will need you to stay late this evening to help me prepare for tomorrow's board meeting. Her eyebrows lifted in clear surprise. Oh, I thought today's schedule was light. I have added new tasks, he lied smoothly. Of course, sir, she said, her voice perfectly polite again, though he saw the disappointment in her eyes. He wanted to tell her the truth, that he just needed to keep her close, to keep her away from the constant glow of her phone screen. Instead, he simply said, You may go. By 7 o'clock that evening, only two people remained in the entire office. Luigi and Melissa. Hours ago, she had slipped off her heels under her desk, trying to hide the deep exhaustion that was now settling into her bones as she worked. The worst kind of power is the power to observe someone who can never look back. From his chair, Luigi watched every tiny movement Melissa made. He saw the way her spine went straight as a rod each time her phone made a sound from inside her desk drawer. She was a bundle of exposed nerves, and he was the only one who knew why. At last, around 7:40 that evening, she surrendered. She rubbed her exhausted eyes and appeared in the doorway of his office. I've finished the financial update, she announced quietly. Will that be all? A tight knot formed in his chest. You are going home? He asked, and the question felt heavy. It is getting very late and I... Her phone buzzed again, a sharp, insistent demand that cut through the silence. Melissa flinched as if struck. Luigi's eyes locked onto her desk drawer. Answer the phone, he commanded, rising to his feet. Her own eyes grew wide with panic. What did you say? He repeated the order, his voice leaving no room for refusal. Take out the phone and look at who is calling you. With trembling legs, she walked back to her desk and slid the drawer open. The screen cast a pale, revealing glow on her face. It read, Andrew. Thinking of you. Did you eat? A small yellow heart emoji pulsed after the words. Melissa's breathing stopped. Her finger hovered over the screen, shaking violently. Luigi moved to stand directly behind her, his voice a low and menacing rumble in her ear. Is that your boyfriend? She turned to stone. No, she whispered, shame and heat flooding her face. He is not my boyfriend. Then what is he to you? A man who sends hearts and offers to appear at your door every single hour is not just a friend. He is something more dangerous. When she finally turned, she gasped, shocked to find him standing so near. Her back was pressed against the hard edge of her desk, with his body completely blocking the light from the office. He was an overwhelming wall of warmth and raw power. "Why do you even care?" she whispered, the question barely audible. He could not give her a real answer. Every truth that came to mind was too revealing, too honest, and far too dangerous to speak aloud. So instead, he deflected. "Is he the reason you always look so completely exhausted?" She blinked, and a fraction of her defiant confidence crumbled. "It is complicated." Luigi despised that word more than any other. He took another step forward, closing the last bit of space between them, and she drew a sharp, panicked breath. "Melissa," he murmured, his voice softening slightly. "You do not need to hide things from me." "I am not hiding anything," she insisted. But the tremor in her voice betrayed her lie. "I just do not want you to think less of me for this." A sharp pain bloomed in his chest. Impossible, he thought. Her lips parted, and for a dangerous second, his gaze dropped to them. The phone buzzed again, a final demanding vibration. "Andrew, I am outside. Call me. Outside the building. Right now." Luigi's heart hammered to a dead stop. "Is he downstairs to pick you up?" he asked, his voice sharp as broken glass. "No," she answered, far too quickly to be telling the truth. "He was not supposed to be here. He just shows up sometimes." "When?" Luigi demanded, his voice low and cold. Her terrified silence was all the confirmation he required. Without another word, he snatched his jacket from his chair and strode with purpose toward the elevator. "Where are you going?" she cried out, stumbling to catch up with him. "I am going to make sure my building is secure." "For me," she whispered, understanding his true meaning. He did not bother to deny it. Down in the grand lobby, a tall, well-dressed man was pacing anxiously in front of the gleaming glass doors. Andrew Cole. Luigi recognized the name instantly from the messages on her phone. The man looked like he belonged to a different world, a cleaner and simpler place that Luigi had left behind long ago. Melissa hurried to stand at Luigi's side, her presence a silent plea. "Andrew, what on earth are you doing here?" The man's face flooded with an almost painful relief at the sight of her. "I was getting worried, Melissa," Andrew said, his voice soft. "You were not answering my calls." Luigi took a small, deliberate step, positioning his body as a shield in front of Melissa. "And who are you?" Luigi's voice was dangerously calm, holding a threat just beneath the surface. "I am her employer." Andrew offered a polite, unsuspecting smile. "Of course. I apologize, I did not mean to interrupt her work. I only came to make sure she was all right." "She was working late tonight," Luigi stated, his tone flat and unyielding. "I was the one who asked her to stay." Melissa's hand touched his arm, a soft, desperate gesture for him to stop, to de-escalate, but her touch only stoked the fire of his anger. "I am fine," she insisted to Andrew. "You really did not have to come all this way." "You look completely worn out," Andrew said, his voice full of concern. "Your dad asked me to check on you." "Andrew," she hissed, her eyes widening in absolute panic as she shot him a warning look. Luigi went perfectly still. Her dad. Suddenly, a critical piece of the puzzle slammed violently into place. Andrew immediately tried to backtrack, realizing his mistake. "I just meant, are you ready to go home now?" Melissa's gaze flickered to Luigi, her eyes asking for his permission to leave. His jaw locked so tight it ached. He wanted to command her to stay. He wanted to say 1,000 things that a boss should never, ever say to his employee. "She is finished for the night," he finally forced the words out. Melissa swallowed hard, relief and something else in her expression. "I will text you," she promised Andrew. "Thank you for coming." Andrew nodded, but the intensely protective way his eyes lingered on her sent a wave of raw, possessive heat burning through Luigi's chest. After Andrew had gone, a heavy, suffocating silence filled the space between them in the empty lobby. "You did not have to come down here with me," Melissa said, her voice barely a whisper. "I did," he replied without hesitation. Why? She asked again, needing to understand. His answer was raw and stripped of all pretense. Because I had to know who that man is to you. Her breath hitched in her throat. I already told you, he is not my boyfriend. That is not a good enough answer. She stared up at him, her eyes a turbulent mix of deep confusion and rising fear. Why do you care about this so much? He closed the remaining distance between them, his voice dropping to a low murmur that was for her alone. Because I do. For a moment, she forgot how to breathe. The vast, quiet lobby seemed to magnify the frantic pounding of her own heart. Luigi, she whispered, her voice trembling. What are we doing? He had no answer for her. He only knew, with absolute certainty, that this was not over. It would not be over until he had unraveled every secret she was hiding from him. That unresolved tension became a third person in the office. It followed them into the next day, a living thing that existed in the charged space between them, in glances that were held for too long and in countless words that were left unspoken. Nothing was normal between them anymore. Then the email arrived, announcing the company party. Luigi's director of operations sent the formal reminder. Client appreciation reception tonight. Your attendance is strongly recommended. Luigi loathed these empty corporate events. They were nothing more than a tedious performance, a ritual of hollow handshakes and meaningless smiles that he was forced to endure. He pressed the button on his intercom. Melissa. Yes, Mr. Key, her clear voice answered immediately. Please come in. She entered his office holding her tablet, her dark hair pulled back neatly from her face. The severe style made her look younger, far too soft and breakable for the harsh realities of his world. Did you see the email about tonight? He asked. Yes, she confirmed, tapping the screen. It begins at 7 in the evening at the Atoria Hotel. You are scheduled to give a speech. He grunted in annoyance. You will be coming with me. She blinked, caught completely off guard. Me? She questioned. I typically coordinate these things from the office. My presence is not required. I want you there, he said, and the tone he used was not a request. It left absolutely no room for argument or discussion. Her lips parted as if she meant to protest. But then she saw the unyielding expression on his face, and she wisely thought better of it. Okay, she conceded softly. I will be there. As she turned to leave his office, he added one more command. Dress appropriately. This is a formal event. She gave a small nod, but he did not miss the faint blush that colored her cheeks just before the door closed behind her. Luigi leaned back in his chair, a wave of anger at himself washing over him. He could have assigned someone else to this. He could have kept her safely away from the prying eyes and the men who would undoubtedly be far too friendly with her. Instead, he had just personally ordered her into a situation that was guaranteed to ignite his worst possessive instincts. The ballroom at the Atoria Hotel was a glittering sea of golden light and expensive dark wood. Luigi arrived before anyone else, dressed in a tailored black suit but without a tie. He despised the feeling of anything tight around his neck. His security detail blended seamlessly into the growing crowd of arriving guests. He moved through the room, shaking hands and offering his carefully controlled smile, but his senses were alert for only one thing. He was waiting for her arrival. He glanced at his watch. 7:13. She was officially late. For Melissa, a woman who lived her life by precise schedules and timetables, 7 minutes was the equivalent of an eternity. He was just reaching for his phone to call her when the entire world seemed to go silent. She had walked into the room. Melissa paused just inside the entrance, gracefully handing her coat to a waiting attendant. Her hair was down tonight, falling in soft, dark waves over her bare shoulders. She wore a simple, elegant black dress that ended just above her knees. The neckline was modestly high, but the way the fabric clung to the curves of her body made his throat go completely dry. Her only jewelry was a pair of small, silver earrings. She did not need anything else. A tight, painful knot formed deep in Luigi's gut as he watched her. She was absolutely devastating. She was nothing short of a vision. He knew that every other woman in the room was looking at her, wishing they could be her, and every man was fantasizing about being the one she finally walked toward. But true power is the only thing that offers real protection, and tonight, she was utterly defenseless. Now you will see what happens when a powerful man decides to become a shield. She stood there for a long moment, her nervousness visible only in the subtle way her hands smoothed the fabric of her dress. Then, her eyes scanned the crowd and found Luigi. A visible wave of relief washed over her, and her shoulders relaxed. She started moving through the throngs of people, offering small, polite smiles as she made her way toward him. "Mr. Key," she said, slightly breathless when she reached him. "I am so sorry I am late. The traffic was terrible. You look—" he began, but he had to stop himself. The words he wanted to use were dangerous. "Perfect. Mine. Appropriate," he finished instead, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. A hint of amusement touched her lips. "Thank you." Just then, his operations director appeared at his side. "Luigi, the Harpers have arrived. Lawson's team is set up in the back corner. We are ready to begin." "Fine," Luigi nodded. Then he turned his intense gaze back to Melissa. "Stay close to me. I will need you." "Of course," she replied, her voice soft. Melissa carried out her duties with flawless perfection. She stayed right beside him, a quiet, graceful, and incredibly efficient presence. She would lean in and whisper essential names into his ear just before he needed them. "That is Mark Lawson. You met with him 3 months ago. His wife's name is Anna, and that is Daniel Harper. You think his voice is too loud." Her soft, conspiratorial tone almost made him laugh out loud. But that closeness did more than just help him with business. It brought them physically nearer. Every time she leaned toward him, he caught the delicate scent of her perfume. It was vanilla, mixed with something else, something uniquely her that he could not name. The sleeve of her dress would brush against his arm. Her fingers would graze the back of his hand as she passed him a document. His focus was fractured, hopelessly divided. On one side was the world of business, and on the other, there was only Melissa. He saw the other men in the room watching her. He saw the way Lawson's assistant stared. He saw the way Harper himself let his eyes linger too long. He hated it with a burning intensity. Later in the evening, after he had delivered his speech, Melissa managed to slip away from his side. She was standing alone by a tall window, looking out at the glittering lights of the city. She was clearly trying to steal a rare moment of peace for herself in the crowded room. Luigi endured another man finishing a long and painfully boring story. He nodded politely, then excused himself. He crossed the large ballroom, forcing himself not to look like he was in a hurry. But he was. He came to a stop at her side. "Tired?" he asked quietly. She jumped, startled, then offered him a small smile. "I am fine. I just needed a minute away from the noise. You managed the networking very well tonight." "Thank you," she said, her smile growing. "You almost smiled a total of 3 times." He snorted. "Your sense of humor is getting bolder. It is late. I tend to get reckless after 9 in the evening." He looked at her, his expression serious. "Are you enjoying yourself at all?" She shrugged one shoulder. "The food is surprisingly good. The view from this window is amazing. And you have only glared in my direction twice." "I did not glare," he protested, almost offended. "You did," she insisted, her eyes full of amusement. "It happened every time someone stared at me for more than a few seconds." He fell silent for a moment, his gaze sweeping the room. "They were staring," he admitted quietly. "I am wearing a dress in a room that is full of business suits," she said with a small sigh. "People are going to stare." "They should not," he countered, his voice firm. She turned then to face him fully, her expression unreadable. "Are you feeling jealous, Mr. Kai?" He met her direct gaze without flinching. "Maybe I am." The air between them suddenly grew thick and heavy. Her playful expression vanished, replaced by something much more fragile and uncertain. "Luigi," she started to say, her voice soft and hesitant. Just then, her phone vibrated inside her small clutch purse. She tensed immediately, her entire body going rigid. The fragile warmth that had been building between them instantly turned to ice. "Is that him?" Luigi asked, his voice flat. She looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "This is not the right time or place for this." "It is him, is it not?" His voice was dangerously low now. She let out a weary sigh. "I just need to make sure that everything is okay." She began moving toward a quiet, empty hallway nearby. He followed her without a word. The sound of the music and conversation faded away behind them. Melissa stopped and checked her phone screen. From over her shoulder, Luigi saw the name glowing there. Andrew. His jaw tightened until it hurt. She put the phone to her ear. "Hey," she said, her voice strained. "I cannot talk for long. I am at a work event right now." She paused, listening to the voice on the other end. "Model." Luigi closed the distance between them, his presence a shadow directly behind her. He tried to convince himself that his only motive was to ensure her safety, to make sure she was not in any trouble. But her quiet words sliced right through him. "I am perfectly fine, I promise you," she murmured into the receiver, her voice soft and reassuring. "You really do not need to worry so much." From the other end of the line, he could hear the low, gentle timbre of a man's voice. It was a sound that felt painfully familiar. Her entire posture seemed to soften with relief. I know," she whispered, a hint of a smile in her tone. "I wish I could be there tonight with you, too." A sharp, unexpected pain seized Luigi's chest. "It is just so complicated right now," she went on, her voice dropping. "But I am getting it all under control. You have already done more than enough for us, especially for him. I just cannot keep depending on you like this." That one word, us, echoed through his mind, a cold and hollow sound. Us who? He took another step forward, his nearness enveloping her completely. She sensed him then, and her body went rigid, immediately ending the conversation. "I really have to go," she said quickly into the phone. "Just text me if there are any changes." She paused, listening for a moment longer. "I know," she whispered finally. "I love you too." In that instant, Luigi felt like the entire world had frozen solid. After ending the call, she spun around, clearly expecting to find an empty hallway. Instead, she came face to face with him. He was standing far too close, and the narrow corridor suddenly felt like it was shrinking around them. "Melissa," he began, his voice a low and sharpened whisper. "Who is he?" She swallowed hard against a dry throat. "You heard all of that? You specifically said us." His intense eyes were searching her face, looking for any hint of deception. "You said it was for him." She squeezed her eyes shut, unable to meet his gaze. "Luigi, please do not do this. You told him that you love him." Her eyes flew open, wide with alarm. "It is not at all what you are thinking." "Then I need you to tell me exactly what it is," he demanded, erasing the last bit of space between them. "Because from where I am standing, all I see is a man who is constantly calling you, and I hear you say words to him that you have never once said to me." "You are my boss," she retorted, a deep blush rising in her cheeks. "You are not supposed to hear words like that from me." "Maybe I want to," he countered, his voice dangerously soft. A heavy, charged silence descended between them, thick with unspoken feelings. "Luigi," she whispered, her own voice trembling with emotion, "you have absolutely no right to be jealous." "I know," he answered without a moment's hesitation. "But are you jealous?" "I am," he admitted without shame. The confession hung in the air, feeling both sharp and perilous. Her fingers tightened around the smooth surface of her phone. "You are crossing a very serious line right now." "You were the one who crossed it first," he countered, his voice dropping even lower. "It happened the day you walked in and made this office feel like something more than just a place I come to work." She made an attempt to step around him, to escape the suffocating intensity, but his hand shot out and slammed against the wall, effectively blocking her only path. Just tell me who this man is to you, he pleaded softly, his anger giving way to a raw need. I operate on facts. It is the only way I can maintain control over things. You are not going to like the facts, she whispered back, a note of warning in her tone. Let them hurt me, he insisted. Her lower lip began to tremble. Andrew is incredibly important to me. He was the one who was there for me through absolutely everything. He provides so much help to my family. And yes, I tell him that I love him because I do. His hand, still pressed against the wall, clenched into a tight, white-knuckled fist. Is he in love with you? Luigi asked, his voice strained. She took a long moment to answer, the hesitation stretching the silence. Yes, I believe that he is. A bitter coldness began to spread through his chest, chilling him from the inside out. And what about you? He made himself ask, dreading the answer. Tears started to well up in her eyes, but she fought them back with a fierce determination, refusing to let even one fall. It is not that simple, she finally said, her voice shaking with the effort to remain composed. My life is a complete mess right now. My dad is sick. I am just doing everything I can to hold all the pieces together. Your father is sick? He repeated slowly, the words changing the entire landscape of the conversation. The scattered pieces of the puzzle in his mind began to violently shift and rearrange themselves. She froze completely. It does not matter, she insisted, trying to shut down the topic. This is not your burden to take on. I am the one who decides what is and is not my burden, he replied, his tone a volatile mixture of simmering anger and deep concern. You have been going through all of this completely alone. You are my boss, she reminded him again, her voice pleading. It is not your job to come in and fix my life. I am also a man who— He cut himself off, stopping just short of saying too much. He trapped her in the hallway, his voice a raw accusation. Who else is thinking about you at 3 in the morning? Tell me that. Who else despises the fact that another man has witnessed your moment of weakness? She made an attempt to sidestep him, to escape the intensity in his eyes, but he shifted his body, effectively blocking her path once more. Please, just let me go, she whispered, her plea hanging in the tense air between them. I will not, he stated, the single word a final verdict. He closed the small gap separating them, his voice dropping to an intimate, low murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. So you can stop pretending that I feel nothing for you. The air left her lungs in a rush. In that single, charged instant, the entire world beyond the narrow corridor simply ceased to exist. It was only the two of them, caught in a silent battle. Her back pressed flat against the cold wall as she tilted her head to look up at his shadowed face. Luigi, what are you doing right now? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. I am losing every bit of my self-control, he admitted without hesitation. His hand lifted slowly, and the knuckles of his fingers grazed her cheek. The touch was so unexpectedly gentle that it created a deep ache within her chest. She found herself leaning into his hand, her eyelids fluttering shut for a brief second of surrender. Just tell me to stop, he breathed, his whisper a ghost against her ear. When her eyes finally opened, they locked directly with his. If I asked you to stop, she questioned softly, would you actually be able to listen? He leaned forward until his forehead rested against hers, releasing a long, slow breath that was filled with frustration and longing. Yes, he confessed with brutal honesty, but I would absolutely hate myself for it. A fragile, heartbreaking smile touched the corners of her lips. I really do not want to be another source of trouble for you. You are not a problem, he countered immediately, his tone firm. You are the only thing in my world that makes any sense right now. He tilted his head just slightly, erasing the final inch of distance that remained between them. Her warm breath caressed his lips, a silent invitation. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed from down the hall, shattering the fragile moment. Mr. Luigi? They are waiting for you to take the group photograph. The spell was broken. Melissa flinched back as if burned, a deep blush rising in her cheeks. He straightened up in an instant, his expression transforming into the guarded, unreadable mask she knew so well. I am coming, he called out, his voice a perfect model of professional control. He then turned his attention back to Melissa. This conversation is not over. I do not know how to handle any of this, she confessed, her hand trembling visibly by her side. You will not have to handle it, he replied with unwavering certainty. I will be the one to handle it. That is not fair to me. This involves my heart, and it involves my family. Exactly, he countered immediately. And that is precisely why I will not leave matters this important in the hands of some man I know nothing about. He took one deliberate step back, creating a necessary distance. Go back into the conference room, put a smile on your face, and pretend that nothing is wrong. And what about you? She asked, her voice small. He methodically adjusted the cuffs on his shirt, his face a perfect blank slate. I am going to find out every single thing there is to know about Andrew Cole. Her eyes widened in alarm. As he started to walk away, he spoke again, the words sounding more like a promise to himself than a statement to her. If I am going to completely lose my control, I refuse to do it while I am blind. Left alone in the now silent hallway, Melissa sagged against the cool wall, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt a profound sense of terror, caught between the mysterious man on the telephone and the powerful boss who had come so close to kissing her just moments ago. A significant choice was looming on the horizon, and she understood with chilling clarity that she could no longer afford to ignore it. That night, Luigi found no rest. He paced the vast expanse of his penthouse apartment, relentlessly haunted by the vivid memory of her trembling breath against his lips and her heartbreaking words about a sick father. However, the one question that echoed in his mind and kept sleep at bay was the one she had never bothered to answer. Was she actually in love with Andrew? Her deafening silence on the matter had been all the answer he needed. By the time the sun rose, Luigi was no longer the calm, collected leader of a business empire. He was simply a man terrified of losing something he had never truly possessed in the first place. At 7 o'clock in the morning, he made a firm decision. He was going to uncover the truth all by himself. Melissa arrived at work at 8:59, exactly 1 minute before she was due. She was dressed in an impeccably professional outfit, as if she were trying to rebuild the professional wall between them brick by brick. They worked for hours in a thick, almost unbearable silence. Finally, at 11:15 in the morning, he rose from his chair. Melissa, I need you in my office. She followed him without a word, her entire body rigid with tension. He calmly closed the heavy door behind them. Please, sit down. He positioned himself in front of her, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Last night, you were not completely honest with me. She stiffened in her chair. Your father is sick, he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. And this man, Andrew, is involved in some capacity. She finally lifted her head to look at him directly. He is my father's doctor. The word landed between them with the force of a physical blow. It suddenly explained so much of what he had misunderstood. Why did you feel the need to keep this a secret from me? He asked, his voice softer now. It is my family's private responsibility, she said, her voice shaking with unshed tears. I did not want you to think that I was incapable of performing my job. Do you really believe I am that cold and unfeeling? No, she breathed out. I think too highly of you. You are responsible for managing a massive empire. You do not need to be bothered with my personal problems. He moved to sit on the edge of his polished desk, leaning in closer to her. Melissa, I always protect my people. Her wounded, guarded eyes finally met his again. How can I possibly be considered one of your people? You already are. The words she wanted to say seemed to get caught in her throat. That simple, undeniable truth settled in the space between them. She was the first one to break eye contact. There is something else, she said, her voice now just a faint whisper. It concerns my father. I know, he answered gently. I took the liberty of investigating Andrew Cole. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief and shock. You did what? He met her furious gaze without so much as flinching. I needed to understand the full situation. Luigi, that is a complete breach of my privacy. Yes, he interrupted her before she could continue. It is. He stood up straight, clasping his hands behind his back. You were hiding a deep pain that is touching every single part of your life, and I was just supposed to stand by and watch you crumble in complete silence? I am not crumbling. You are, he stated with a calm certainty. You are just doing a remarkable job of pretending that you are not. She rose slowly to her feet, her chest heaving with emotion. You had no right to do that, she said in a low, sharp tone. You left me with no other choice. They stood in a tense standoff, both of them rigid with their own hurt feelings. What did you find out? She finally whispered, unable to bear the suspense. His expression softened with a feeling that went much deeper than simple pity. I reviewed your father's medical files, he said quietly. I saw all of the appointments, the proposed treatment plans, and the recurring problems with the billing. Fresh tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. You saw all of that? Yes, he confirmed, his voice gentle. And I also saw that Andrew is much more than just a doctor to your family. He has been protecting all of you in ways that go far beyond the normal requirements of his job. A single tear finally escaped and traced a slow, silent path down her cheek. He makes personal house calls for your father, Luigi explained, his tone full of respect. He completely rearranged his own work schedule to be there on the nights when your brother was not available. He even ignored overdue bills when the insurance company was delaying their payments. Melissa pressed a hand tightly over her mouth, desperately trying to stifle a sob that threatened to overwhelm her. He has been your family's unwavering anchor through this storm, Luigi said softly. I was able to see that much very clearly. She looked up at him, her expression a heartbreaking mixture of profound gratitude and deep pain. Then why did you think he was something more to me? Because I love you. He could not bring himself to say the words out loud. Instead, he said, I overheard you telling him that you loved him. Luigi, she whispered, slowly shaking her head. It is not like that at all. He is like family to us now. I love him because he is saving my father's life. I love him for giving us back our hope. The air seemed to rush back into his lungs, filling a space he hadn't realized was empty. And he is in love with you, Luigi stated, his voice now gentle and understanding. She paused for a moment. Maybe he is. I am not entirely sure. He has never actually said anything to me about it. Has he ever tried to cross a professional line with you? No, she said immediately, without a hint of hesitation. He is nothing but professional and incredibly kind. He cares deeply about my family's well-being. That is all it is. A quiet, peaceful moment passed between them as the last of the tension finally dissolved. Do you believe me? Her voice was a fragile whisper. Yes, he answered without hesitation. She released a trembling breath, her hand coming up to wipe at her face. Then please, she begged, do not make this any harder on me. My life is already complicated enough. Luigi moved toward her, his steps deliberate and slow, the way someone might approach a frightened animal they wished only to comfort. You do not have to carry this burden by yourself, he murmured, his voice soft. Yes, I do, she insisted, shaking her head. This is my problem to solve. It is my responsibility. He gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumb stroking away a single tear that escaped. It became my responsibility too, he said, his voice a low, warm current. It happened the moment I started to see you as more than just my assistant. Her breath caught in her throat. She found herself leaning into the solid warmth of his hand, a small but unmistakable act of surrender. Another tear slid down her cheek. Her shoulders, which had been tense for so long, finally slumped in defeat. He guided her to the couch and sat beside her as she finally let the carefully built walls around her heart crumble. My dad's health took a turn for the worse 2 months ago, she admitted, the words spilling out. Andrew says he needs a major surgery, and it has to happen soon. It is incredibly expensive, and my insurance will not cover a huge part of it. I have been saving every single dollar I earn, even taking on extra freelance work at night. I am just so tired, Luigi. I am terrified, she confessed, and I was so ashamed for you to see me like this. Her voice shattered on those last few words. Something sharp and painful twisted inside Luigi's chest. This woman was not weak. She was a warrior, fighting a desperate battle all on her own because she felt she had to be the strong one for everybody else in her life. Melissa, he said, his voice full of a feeling she had never heard before. He placed a warm, steadying hand on her shoulder. Why did you not tell me any of this? She whispered back. I did not want you to be disappointed in me. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, fighting back the overwhelming urge to pull her into his arms and promise he would never let her go. You could never disappoint me. Her fingers tightened on the fabric of his sleeve, a desperate grip. For the very first time, she did not try to hide the trembling in her hands. For the first time, she let him see the complete, unfiltered truth of her fear. And for the very first time, he allowed himself to touch her without a moment of hesitation. He gently drew her against his chest. She did not resist. She simply collapsed into him, her head finding a place on his shirt as she finally let herself cry soft, exhausted sobs. His arms formed a firm protective circle around her small frame. You are not alone now, he whispered into her hair. She held on to him, clinging to him like a person who had been struggling to stay afloat in a raging sea for far too long. They remained that way for a long time, until her frantic breathing finally calmed into a steady rhythm. She pulled back just a little, her face flushed and stained with tears. I am so sorry. I should not have done that. Never apologize for that, he commanded softly. Not to me. A faint blush colored her cheeks, but then the fear quickly returned to her eyes. What are we going to do now? She whispered, sounding lost. Luigi's gaze was firm and resolute. Now, he said with undeniable certainty, I am going to help you. No, she replied instantly, the word a reflex. You cannot do that. I can, he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. And I will. She suddenly stood, putting space between them. Luigi, I am not a charity case. I do not want to be in your debt. He rose to face her, his height making her feel small. This is not charity. This is me taking care of someone who is important to me. Her lips parted in surprise. You are important to me, he repeated, his voice dropping low and serious. More important than I should probably admit out loud. You are crossing a line again, she warned, though her voice lacked conviction. He slowly shook his head. No, he whispered, his eyes locked on hers. I am drawing a new one. Her breath caught in her chest. Before either of them could say another word, her phone buzzed loudly from her bag on the floor. They both froze, the spell between them broken. She retrieved it with trembling hands. It was a text message from Andrew. It said, Call me. It is urgent. All the color instantly drained from her face, leaving her pale and drawn. Oh no! Luigi moved closer in an instant, his own body growing tense with alarm. What is it? What's wrong? She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a fresh wave of terror. It is my dad, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Something is wrong. The entire world seemed to stop moving. In that single, heart-stopping moment, Luigi knew he would not, under any circumstances, let her face this by herself. Back in his office, Melissa trembled uncontrollably, her eyes wide with a panic that chilled him to the bone. Luigi had seen people afraid before, but he had never seen anything that compared to the raw terror etched on her face. "What happened?" he asked, grabbing his jacket from the back of his chair. "I do not know," she said, her voice cracking under the strain. "Andrew just said it is urgent. It is my dad. I have to go to him right now." "Then we go," Luigi declared, his decision made. "We?" she repeated, looking at him with confusion. "Yes," he confirmed. His tone was absolute, leaving no room for argument or debate. "You are not going to face this alone." "But your meetings," she protested weakly. "Your schedule." "Cancel everything," he said to his empty office. The only thing that mattered in the entire world was getting her to her father's side. "Luigi, you really do not have to do this." "I am not leaving you," he stated, his voice deeper and more serious than she had ever heard it. "Not tonight. Not ever." Her lower lip trembled as she stared at him, unable to form a response. Within minutes, they were inside his SUV, the bright city lights blurring into long streaks of color outside the windows. Melissa sat rigidly beside him in the passenger seat, clutching her phone in a white-knuckled grip. Her breathing was shallow and far too fast. Luigi shifted closer, his presence a solid and calming force. "You are safe," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "Whatever is happening, I am right here with you." She did not look at him, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Thank you," she whispered. Those two simple words felt like a solemn promise passing between them. When they arrived at the apartment building, Melissa bolted from the car before it had even fully stopped. Luigi was right behind her, matching her pace. Inside the apartment, a man he recognized as Andrew Cole was waiting for them. "Melissa," he said softly, his expression full of concern. "I am so glad you are here." She rushed past him, heading straight for the bedroom. "Is he okay? What happened to him? He was completely fine last night." "Melissa, you need to just breathe," Andrew said, his voice a calm anchor in her storm. "Your father is in a stable condition now. His blood pressure shot up for a while, but he is getting the rest he needs." She sagged against the doorframe, a choked sob of pure relief escaping her lips. Andrew reached out and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Across the room, Luigi's jaw clenched into a hard line. The doctor caught the subtle movement and, with a respectful dip of his head, immediately dropped his hand. "Mr. Key," he acknowledged, "I am very glad to see that she has you here with her." Luigi offered a short, clipped nod in response. "I promise I do not want to interfere in any way," Andrew continued, his gaze shifting back to Melissa. "I am simply overcome with gratitude that she is not going through this ordeal by herself." Melissa's eyes darted to Luigi. A silent, desperate plea held within them. The sharp sting of jealousy he had felt earlier was gone, erased by the memory of her whispered, exhausted thank you in the car on the way over. Even so, he maintained a deliberate, careful distance from Andrew. "You mentioned his pressure spiked," Luigi asked, his tone all business. "What was the specific cause?" Andrew seemed to hesitate for a moment. "Tell him everything," Melissa urged, her voice thin. Andrew nodded. "It was a combination of factors: the severe stress, the mounting fatigue, and the critical delay in receiving his medication last week." She turned her head away, unable to meet either man's eyes as she spoke, her voice tight with guilt. "I am so incredibly sorry. I was trying to be on time with it, but my work schedule—" Andrew cut her off gently. "This is not your fault, Melissa. You are doing absolutely everything within your power, but you simply cannot carry this burden all alone." Her eyes squeezed shut as a crushing weight settled on her chest. "I have been telling her the very same thing," Luigi said, and the unexpected softness in his voice made her head snap up. She stared at him, startled. This was not the cold, demanding boss she had come to know. This was a man whose words carried a quiet sincerity. A few moments later, Andrew excused himself to check on her father, leaving them in the quiet waiting area. Melissa collapsed onto the worn couch and buried her face in her hands. Luigi moved to sit near her, not touching, but offering a solid, silent presence. "I feel like I am completely failing him," she whispered into her palms. "My father needs a major operation. My brother is barely keeping his head above water. I cannot bear the thought of losing my dad." "You are not going to lose him," Luigi said, his voice a low, steady promise. "How can you possibly know that?" she cried out, the tears she had been holding back finally breaking free and streaming down her face. "Everything is just falling apart around me. I was so afraid to tell you," she admitted, her voice raw. "I thought you would think I was weak, that I was just a burden." Her voice cracked with emotion. "And I cannot lose my job too. It is all I have. Melissa." He reached over and carefully took her trembling hand in his. "You are not losing anything," he said firmly, his grip warm and steady. "You are not losing your job. You are not losing my respect. And you are not losing me." She caught her breath, whispering, "I should not have to rely on you for this." "But you do," he answered gently, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "And I am glad that you are." A few minutes later, Andrew returned from the bedroom. "He is sleeping peacefully," he reported. "But we need to make a solid plan for the surgery tomorrow. Time is getting very short now." She gave a weak, tired nod. "You are not alone in this anymore," Andrew told her, his gaze moving meaningfully between her and Luigi. For the first time that night, a silent, unspoken understanding passed between the three of them. A shared goal to protect the people in that room. "I should probably go," Andrew said. "Call me if you need anything at all." "Thank you, Andrew," Melissa whispered as he left. When the door clicked shut, she turned to face Luigi, her expression completely raw and honest. "Why are you really here?" she asked. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Because I could not imagine you going through this all by yourself." Fresh tears filled her eyes, but they were different this time. They were warmer, filled with something other than fear. "Luigi," she started, but he cut her off. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the absolute truth," he said, his voice low and serious. "Did you mean it when you told Andrew that you loved him? Was it the kind of love a woman has for a man?" She shook her head immediately, without a hint of hesitation. "No, it was the love a grateful daughter has for the man who is saving her father's life." A visible wave of relief washed over Luigi's face, softening his features. "Then answer me this," he whispered, his eyes searching hers. "Is there someone else that you love?" The question hung in the charged air between them. She did not say a word. She just looked at him, and in the profound silence, he felt her answer in every part of his soul. "I cannot," she whispered, her voice fragile. "I cannot think about that right now." "That is not a no," he observed quietly. "It is not a yes, either," she replied, her gaze falling to her hands. "Then what is it?" he asked, his voice barely there, afraid to break the delicate moment. "It is me," she confessed, "being afraid of wanting something that I know I should not." He gently touched her chin with his fingers, making her look up at him. "Do you want me?" he asked directly. She closed her eyes as tears began to fall again. "And I want you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "more than anything else in this world." He used his thumb to tenderly wipe a tear from her cheek. "I cannot kiss you right now," he whispered, his own control strained. "Not while your heart is broken like this. Not tonight." She nodded, trembling under his touch. "But do not ever think for a second that I do not want to." A shiver ran through her as she leaned toward him, seeking comfort and safety. He pulled her against his chest in a slow, deeply protective embrace. "You are not alone," he repeated, the words a solemn vow, and this time she finally believed him. She relaxed against his solid frame as the minutes stretched on, her breathing finally evening out into a calm, steady rhythm. After a long while, she gently pulled back. "I should go check on him," she whispered. "I will come with you," he offered immediately. "No," she said softly, placing a hand on his chest. "Please, just stay here for a moment. I need a little time to think." He nodded, understanding her need for space, and let her go. Luigi let out a long, slow breath he did not realize he had been holding. He had crossed a significant line tonight, but then, so had she. He knew that tomorrow was going to change everything between them. As he waited in the quiet, dimly lit living room, he knew one thing with absolute and unshakable certainty. He was no longer afraid of wanting her. He was only afraid of losing her. When she returned from the bedroom, she was not crying anymore. Her face was set with a new and clear determination. "Luigi," she said, her voice steady. "We have to talk." He stood up to face her, his heart beginning to pound with a steady, expectant rhythm against his ribs. "There is something you do not know about me," she said, her voice quiet but perfectly clear. "Something that I have kept hidden from everyone." He had dealt with secrets and hidden information his entire life, but this felt completely different. This was about her. He deliberately kept his own voice even and calm. "Then tell me," he said. She glanced nervously toward the closed bedroom door. "Not out here," she whispered. "He might wake up and overhear us." Luigi understood and gave a simple nod. She led him into the kitchen, a small, cramped space with a little table pressed tightly against the far wall. He waited patiently, bracing himself, ready to hear whatever it was she had to say. The coffee maker on her counter was ancient, but it was the one thing in her life that felt entirely hers. Melissa sat alone at her tiny kitchen table, methodically tearing a paper napkin into 100 small pieces. When Luigi entered, the small space seemed to shrink. He pulled out the chair directly across from her, their knees so close they almost brushed against each other. The silence was heavy. "Whatever you have to say," he began, his voice low and steady. "I need it to come from you." She drew a shaky breath, the air burning her lungs. "I was going to quit my job." The words hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his chest. "When were you planning this?" he demanded, his posture instantly becoming rigid and defensive. "In another few weeks," she answered, her gaze fixed on the ruined napkin in her hands. "As soon as I had a little more money saved, after my father's surgery date was finally set. My plan was to leave on good terms, give my notice, and then just vanish." He could only stare at her, utterly blindsided. This was the last thing he had ever expected to hear. "You were going to vanish?" he echoed, the words tasting like ash. Tears began to cloud her vision, hot and unwelcome. "Yes," she choked out. "Without even talking to me? Without giving me a single chance to help you?" He bit back the words that were really fighting to get out. "A chance to show you how much I love you." "I did not want you to feel like you had to," she explained, her voice thick with emotion. "I refused to be the kind of person who stayed just because of what she could get from you." A dry, bitter laugh escaped his lips. It was a sound completely devoid of humor. With a trembling hand, she pushed her phone across the cheap wooden table. It was open to a drafted email. The subject line was stark and simple. "Resignation, Melissa Davis." "You've already written it out," he observed, his voice flat. "Yes." His eyes flew across the screen, taking in the cold, perfectly professional language she had used. It was a punch to the gut. "And you were honestly going to send this?" he asked, his voice raw with disbelief. "Yes," she whispered, unable to meet his gaze. "I would have sent it." "Why?" he pressed, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Tell me the real reason you were going to do this." She swallowed hard, the weight of the truth finally becoming too much to bear. "Because I was falling in love with my boss, at the exact same time my entire life was falling to pieces," she confessed, the admission hanging in the air between them like a fragile thing. He had demanded the truth, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like a brand new kind of pain. "You were going to walk away from a job you love, and from me, because of how you felt?" he asked, processing each word with deliberate slowness. "Yes," she confirmed, her hands now shaking uncontrollably in her lap. I did not want you to feel trapped by my problems. I could not stand the thought of people whispering that I only stayed because of who you are, because of your money and your power. He leaned forward, closing the small distance between them, until his voice was an intense, private murmur. You are not ruining my life, Melissa, he said, his words sharp with conviction. You were quickly becoming the only part of it that felt real, the only part that felt worth a single thing. Her breath caught in her throat. She finally looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock. I am not saying any of this because I feel sorry for you, he continued, his gaze holding hers with an unyielding force. I am saying this because the idea of you actually quitting, of you not being there anymore, causes me a physical kind of pain. A single fat tear broke free and traced a path down her cheek. I kept telling myself that if I left, it would be easier for everyone, she whispered brokenly. That you would just move on and hire somebody else to take my place. I do not want someone else, he stated, his voice absolute. You are just not getting it, she whispered back, the words aching in her throat. You are Luigi. You're powerful. You are always in control. I am just a woman desperately trying to keep her father alive while trying not to completely fall apart in front of the man She stopped herself abruptly, unable to finish the sentence. The man she what? He prompted, his tone softening with gentleness. She shook her head, unable to speak the words again. I cannot say it a second time. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I want to hear it again. A deep blush colored her cheeks. If I say it again, I will not be able to let you go. His hand moved across the table then, warm and firm as it covered hers. I am not planning on letting you go, he said, his voice a low vibration that traveled up her arm. Not as my assistant, and certainly not as the woman I want in my life. This is about the surgery. It is about money, she insisted, trying to bring reality back into the room. This is not just about feelings, Luigi. I know that, he said, his fingers tightening around hers in a gesture of reassurance. And that is precisely why I am going to handle that part of it for you. Her eyes went wide with alarm. No, absolutely not. I will not accept your charity. This has nothing to do with charity, he said, his tone firm and unyielding. Then what is it? She demanded, her voice rising with a mix of frustration and desperation. His answer came out quiet, but it was filled with unwavering certainty. It is love. The entire world seemed to screech to a halt around them. She could only stare at him, completely speechless, her mind racing. You do not have to say it back to me, he told her softly, recognizing the profound shock etched on her face. But I refuse to pretend that this is simply about an employee who needs some financial help, he continued, his voice earnest. I care about your father's health because he is your father. I care about this surgery because it is a critical part of your life. Her chin began to tremble. You already have all of my trust, she whispered, the confession sounding like a painful admission. That is the very reason this is so terrifying. His thumb began to trace a slow, soothing circle over the back of her hand. Then please let me prove to you that you were right to trust me, he murmured, his voice a gentle plea. Let me be there for you. Let me be your boss. Let me be your support. Let me be the man who loves you. Just promise me you will not shut me out of your life again. A long, slow breath escaped her, and she felt the tension in her shoulders finally begin to release its hold. She glanced down at their joined hands, a silent acknowledgement of their new connection. You need to talk to Andrew, she said softly, her voice gaining strength. Ask him exactly what we need for the surgery, the real numbers. I do not want any sugarcoating. I will call him first thing, Luigi promised without hesitation. And you have to let me pay back every single dollar you put in, she added, her gaze sharp and determined. He hesitated for a moment. We can negotiate the payment plan later, Luigi. He let out a soft sigh. Fine. You can start paying me back by promising you will not send that resignation email. She finally looked up and met his eyes. Is that really what you want from me? She asked. Yes, he said simply. And anything else you might decide to give me after that? Well, I will just consider that a bonus. Her cheeks flushed a deep red as she held his intense gaze. Okay, she whispered. I will not quit. He looked so profoundly relieved that she thought he might actually smile for the first time that evening. Just then, a soft cough echoed from the bedroom. It was her dad. Melissa immediately rushed to the door, with Luigi following a few steps behind her. Her father's tired eyes fluttered open as she approached. Hey, she said gently, sitting on the edge of his bed. You gave me a scare. I am fine, he rasped, his voice weak. You worry far too much. It is my job to worry, she replied with a small smile. His gaze drifted past her and landed on the tall figure of Luigi standing in the doorway. Who is this? He asked, his voice a bit stronger. Is this the important boss you are always talking about? Dad? Melissa whispered, her entire body freezing in place. Good evening, Mr. Davis, Luigi said, stepping confidently into the room. My name is Luigi. I have the pleasure of working with your daughter. Her dad studied him for a long moment. Or do you make her work too hard? Luigi offered a small, disarming smile. It is probably both, he admitted honestly. But I am actively working on it. Are you the one who is making my daughter's life so difficult? Her father asked directly. Oh my God, Melissa muttered, hiding her face in her hands. I might be, Luigi replied, his eyes warm with sincerity as he looked at Melissa. But I am also the one who is going to make absolutely certain you get the best medical care possible. You know about that? Her father asked, his gaze becoming sharp and focused. I told him, Melissa confirmed quietly. And he is still standing here? Her dad asked, his eyes moving from his daughter to Luigi. Yes, Luigi answered for her, his voice solid and sure. I am not going anywhere. The old man looked between the two of them, and a flicker of deep understanding passed through his tired eyes. Then I suppose I do not need to worry any more, he said with finality. He reached out for Melissa's hand, then gestured toward Luigi. You two need to figure things out. Just do not let her carry the weight of this world by herself any longer. Luigi stepped closer to the bed. I will not, he promised, his voice low and solemn. You have my word on that. Her father gave a slight nod, his eyes already closing as he drifted back into a peaceful sleep. She leaned back against the wall, her breath leaving her in a sudden, shaky rush. Luigi stood in front of her, his presence filling the small hallway. Are you all right? He asked, his voice full of concern. No, she admitted honestly. But I am better than I was. He nodded in understanding. She looked up at him, her eyes finally clear of tears. If you really help with the surgery, she began, the words coming out slowly and carefully, and I really stay at the company, and we actually try this. Her voice trembled with vulnerability. What if it all just falls apart? What if I am not enough for you? What if you wake up one day and regret all of this? He moved toward her in one fluid motion, bracing his hand on the wall beside her head. Complications and problems do not worry me, he said, his voice a low, intense rumble. You walking away from me, that worries me. Her pulse began to race uncontrollably. You should not say things like that, she whispered. Why not? Because it makes it impossible for me to protect myself. Maybe it is finally time you stop trying to, he replied. His other hand settled gently but firmly on her waist. She did not even think of pulling away. Her next words were barely a breath of sound. If I let myself fall in love with you, Luigi, I will be completely lost. You already are, he whispered back, his lips just inches from hers. You just need to finally admit it to yourself. Her heart felt like it seized in her chest. He was impossibly, overwhelmingly close now. Tell me to go, he urged quietly, his eyes searching hers. Tell me that you do not want this to happen. All of her carefully constructed defenses crumbled into dust. Stay, she breathed. That was all the permission he needed. His kiss was slow, deep, and impossibly careful. It was not a kiss driven by passion, but a kiss that felt like a solemn promise of patience. It was a kiss that said, I am here now. You are finally safe. Her hands came up to clutch the front of his shirt as if he were a lifeline. His arm wrapped around her, pulling her gently closer until there was no space left between them. When they finally parted for air, she rested her forehead against the solid wall of his chest. What do we do now? She whispered into the fabric of his shirt. He simply smiled, the expression hidden against her hair. Tomorrow I will speak with Andrew, he said, his voice calm and decisive. We will create a solid plan, and we will handle everything for the surgery. You will delete that email. You will come back to the office on Monday, and we will act completely normal. Her voice was small and uncertain. And what about when we are alone? His reply was immediate and direct. When we are alone, we will stop pretending. Her face grew warm at the implication. But what if everything goes wrong? He leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. Then we will face it together, he promised her. There will be no more secrets, no more running away. She breathed out slowly, letting his words sink in and soothe her frayed nerves. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a small spark of hope began to mix with the constant fear in her heart. She gave him a single decisive nod. Okay, she whispered. We will do it your way. He smiled down at her. Our way, he corrected softly. A message buzzed in his pocket then, a high-priority security alert from his office. A dark, unwelcome thought invaded his mind. Could he truly protect her from the dangers of his world? Or would loving her only succeed in dragging her into a life she never asked for? He did not have the answer. But starting tomorrow, he was going to find out. Luigi's phone vibrated again in his pocket, but he chose to ignore it. Melissa was still pressed against him, her warm breath a gentle caress on his neck. Her fingers were resting lightly on his shirt, almost as if she was just now realizing that she was truly allowed to touch him this way. I do not want this moment to end, she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. Then it will not, he murmured in response, his hand moving up to trace the delicate line of her jaw. We will build 100 more moments just like this one, and then 100 more after that. A profound trust bloomed in her eyes, a look that made his chest ache with a kind of happiness he had not known he was missing. The phone buzzed a third time, more insistent now. He sighed. I have to get this. She nodded and took a small step back, just enough for him to reach into his pocket. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from Marco, his head of security. It was an urgent update regarding the surgical approval process. He let out a quiet breath, relieved that it was not about some new danger. Melissa watched him, her expression anxious. Is it bad news? She asked. No, he said, his voice reassuring. It is just the real world calling. Her smile was tired, but it was genuine. It always shows up, does not it? He cupped her cheek with his free hand, grounding her. I will handle it. Tonight, you just need to focus on your dad. She nodded, her hand still holding tightly to his. Luigi made sure to arrive at the office exceptionally early the following morning. He was determined to be there when she walked through the doors. He wanted to witness her entering his world, not as an employee trying to hide her struggles, but as a person walking toward him with purpose. At 8:59, just before the start of the day, she appeared. She was dressed in simple beige pants and a cream-colored blouse, but she carried herself with a newfound air of confidence that was unmistakable. He rose from his chair behind the large desk. Good morning, he said, his voice filled with a warmth she had rarely heard from him. Morning, she replied, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. She proceeded to her own desk and began to organize her work just as she did every other day. But the entire atmosphere felt different, charged with a new reality. because now she was no longer pretending. A minute later, he emerged from his office. Melissa, she looked up from her screen. We have a meeting with Dr. Cole at 12 o'clock noon. A complex mixture of fear and profound gratitude washed over her expression. Okay, she whispered, her voice barely audible. And later tonight, he added, his tone leaving no room for argument, I will be taking you to dinner. Is that supposed to be a date? She asked, a hint of a challenge in her eyes. Yes, it is, and you are not allowed to say no. She bit down on her lower lip, trying and failing to hide a small smile. I was not planning on it. He went back into his office, feeling lighter and more hopeful than he had in many months. At noon, they met Andrew in a private consultation room at the clinic. Andrew walked in holding a medical chart, his professional demeanor softening as his eyes landed on Melissa. It is good to see you both, he said with a genuine smile. Luigi stood to shake his offered hand. Doctor. Andrew was a picture of professionalism, but his observant eyes missed nothing. You mentioned you wanted all the specific details, he began, looking at Luigi. That is correct, Luigi confirmed, his voice firm. We do not want any filters. We need to know everything. Melissa sat down beside him, taking a slow, deep breath to steady her nerves. Andrew clipped the charts onto a display board. The good news is that your father is a candidate for the surgery, he explained carefully. However, it is critical that it happens within the next 6 weeks. Melissa gave a sharp nod, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the arms of her chair. Andrew continued. The insurance policy will not cover nearly enough of the costs. Between the hospital stay, the surgeon's fees, and the extensive aftercare, it is a significant amount. But the condition itself is entirely treatable. Her throat felt tight with a mix of hope and dread. Oh, thank God. Underneath the table, hidden from view, Luigi reached over and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. Andrew's gaze flickered down for just a fraction of a second, noticing their joined hands. The primary obstacle here is the cost, he stated carefully, choosing his words with precision. But it is something that can be managed if you have help. Melissa opened her mouth to speak, to protest. Andrew, I cannot possibly ask for that. You are not asking me for anything, he said gently, cutting her off. And you are not asking him either. She looked down at her lap, ashamed. The last thing she ever wanted was to be a charity case for anyone. Luigi spoke before her resolve could completely break. I am covering the entire cost. Andrew blinked, momentarily surprised. Mr. Key, this is not a negotiation, Luigi said, his tone flat and final. You will schedule the surgery for the earliest possible date, provide my office with the payment deadlines and all the invoices. I will handle everything from there. Andrew nodded his head slowly, a look of understanding dawning on his face. I had a feeling you might say that. Tears of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude filled Melissa's eyes. Luigi, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I do not even know how I can thank you. You do not have to, he said softly, turning to face her. You do not owe me anything except your honesty. She wiped a stray tear from her cheek. Andrew cleared his throat, breaking the intimate moment. I am just so glad she has people who are watching out for her. All traces of jealousy were gone from his voice, replaced by sincere relief. After they had discussed the remaining details, Andrew placed a hand on Melissa's arm. If you ever need anything at all, he said, his voice full of warmth, you know I am still here for you. She offered him a grateful smile. I know that, Andrew. But when they left the room, she walked out right beside Luigi. Andrew watched them go, a small, sad smile on his face. That evening, Luigi arrived to pick her up at 7 o'clock. She was wearing a simple black dress that, on her, looked absolutely breathtaking. You look incredibly beautiful, he said, his voice low with appreciation. She teased him gently, her confidence blooming. You look beautiful too. He let out a soft chuckle. I do not think that is how this is supposed to work. It works that way tonight, she replied with a playful smile. He took her to a cozy, warm Italian restaurant filled with the soft glow of candlelight. She seemed to relax the moment they sat down. "Why did you choose this place?" she asked curiously. "Because I thought you needed comfort tonight, not a display of luxury," he told her honestly. Her expression softened with understanding. For the very first time, they talked for hours with no walls or pretenses between them. She told him stories about her childhood, her dreams, and her complicated family. He, in turn, told her things he had never confessed to anyone else, about the profound loneliness that came with power, and about the exact moment he knew he was lost when she first walked into his office. Her hand found his across the polished wood of the table and remained there, a silent anchor. Later, standing outside, the night air was cool against their skin. "Are you feeling cold?" he asked. "Just a little," she admitted. Without a word, he took off his suit jacket and wrapped it carefully around her shoulders. She pulled the lapels close, inhaling the subtle, comforting scent of him. "Luigi," she said, her voice quiet in the darkness. "You told me that you love me." He looked directly at her, his gaze unwavering and completely serious. "I meant every word of it." Her next breath was a little shaky. "I am so scared," she whispered, confessing her deepest fear. "So am I," he admitted. "But the need to be with you is so much stronger than the fear." She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the dim light. "I think I am falling in love with you too." He leaned down and finally kissed her, a deep, searching kiss filled with months of unspoken desire and profound relief. She melted against him, her arms winding around his neck, pulling him closer. For the first time, neither of them was afraid of the world, only of the devastating possibility of losing each other. Her father's vital surgery was officially scheduled. Luigi managed every single detail with quiet efficiency, never once making her feel indebted or small. He took the time to meet her brother, had multiple conversations with Andrew, and dealt directly with the hospital's billing department so she would not have to. Melissa finally told him that she loved him 2 nights before the operation was set to take place. She said the words while leaning comfortably against his chest on the sofa in his apartment. He kissed her then, a kiss that felt like he had been waiting his entire life just to hear her say those 3 words. On the morning of the surgery, she was consumed by terror. He refused to leave her side, holding her hand tightly through every single agonizing minute of the long, silent wait in the sterile hospital corridor. The doctor's words, when they finally came, were clear and direct. The surgery was a complete success. At that moment, Melissa finally broke. She collapsed into Luigi's arms, and great, shuddering sobs of absolute relief shook her entire body. From that day forward, everything in her life changed for the better. Her father began a steady and complete recovery. Her brother, freed from some of his financial stress, found a much better and more stable job. Melissa never quit her position. Instead, Luigi had her desk moved from the outer office into his own, placing it closer to his. She would often tease him, saying he just needed to have her in his line of sight at all times. He never once disagreed with her. Their lives settled into a new, beautiful rhythm, one that was built on a foundation of genuine love and unwavering support. She continued to work as his trusted assistant, but they were careful to keep their professional lives and their personal life together distinctly separate. One night, she asked him if he ever had any regrets about their relationship. He leaned over and kissed her shoulder softly. Not for a single second. Power and ambition had been the forces that drove him his entire life. But he learned that nothing could ever compare to the feeling of loving her. Melissa was the missing piece of his life's puzzle, and their shared future proved that true power is not about control. It is about having the strength to protect the ones you love. Before we conclude this story, I have a small favor to ask of you. If you found any value or enjoyment in this story, please consider subscribing to my channel. Your support truly helps me more than you could possibly realize, and it is what allows me to continue creating more videos just like this one for you to enjoy. The subscription link is located directly below this video. If you happen to be watching this on a television screen, you can simply point your phone's camera at the QR code that is now displayed on the screen. This very simple action is the most meaningful and direct way you can support my work.